think there's a few friends still joining us, but while they're coming in, we'll get started. So welcome friends, Parikalust, to this event run by the Armenian Institute and platforming our friends at the Queer Armenian Library. The event tonight is part of a series of events which we're running under a project enabled by a very generous grant from the National Lottery Heritage Foundation. And you can find out more about this on our website, but it's a series of events and podcasts and different kinds of content which explore a number of themes, including migration, displacement and refugees, neighbours, historic and present, literary heritage, particularly related to our unique library collection, which we're running a fundraiser for at the moment, and my colleague director Tatavik will put into the chat now the link for that fundraising. And last but very much not least, exploring gender, understanding identities, histories and heritage. And it's under that theme that we're really excited to bring the event here tonight. This theme is supposed to uncover the little spoken about identities and particularly gender, queer and sexuality identities in Armenian culture, with discussions about feminism, LGBTQ+ issues, and a whole range of issues. So this is the first event that we've been able to run under this theme, and we're really, really excited to hear from JP and to hear more about the Queer Armenian Library. Just a bit about the format for tonight. So when I've finished introducing, Tatavik will introduce JP, who's then going to give us a presentation and an overview of the project, and then we'll have time for open discussion at the end. And we'll go up until 9 o'clock. So without further ado, Tatavik.
Thank you very much, Nick. Good evening, everyone. So I became aware of Queer Armenian Library first before I knew JP. I saw the expression mentioned on Twitter a few times, and I thought, like we were just saying, too good to be true. It's something much needed, and most narratives about queer Armenianness and queer Armenian identity concerns human rights. But it was wonderful to see something connected to art, books, and especially the word library, which we love so much at the Armenian Institute. Then I realized that the JP is connected to another wonderful organization we often talk to and work with, Armenian International Literary Alliance. And I mentioned it to Olivia Katranjan, who is part of the organization. She put us in touch, and the rest, like they say, is history. John Parker Boghossian is the founder and curator of the Queer Armenian Library and is the current president of the Armenian Cultural Organization of Minnesota. He also serves as an equality and inclusion officer for Normandale Community College. He has published and edited publications about the Minnesota LGBTQ standards of inclusion. And he has a number of current writing projects, including something about Soghomon, Tehlirian and Shepard, as well as a short story inspired by poetry of Vahan Tekeyan. His essay, The Wars, shares the founding of the Queer Armenian Library and will be published by the University of Texas Press in the forthcoming anthology of Armenian Diasporan writers. So I'll stop here, and I'm very proud and very privileged to welcome JP to open the doors of his wonderful library and let us in.
Very honored to be invited here this evening for all of you and for me this afternoon in Minnesota. Whenever I give a talk, I like to greet folks in Armenian, French, and English. So, Pari Irigun, Shadurachem, Hedline Laisor, bonjour, bonsoir. Je suis très heureux d'être ici avec vous. And hello, good evening. I'm very happy to be with you here today. The reason why I like to greet folks in these three languages is to honor the journeys of those who have come before me and helped me get to this particular space. So my mom's side of the family is Armenian, originating in Harput and Artsakh. After the genocide, they made it to Beirut as survivors, and then on work visas and refugee visas immigrated to France. Hence, I'm a dual citizen of France and the United States. My mom and her sister immigrated to the States in the late 70s. My preferred name is JP. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns. I self-identify as queer. I live in a polyamorous relationship with 2 men here in Minnesota. And I also like to just share these markers of identity whenever I start a talk so that you can understand more clearly the perspective that I bring to this work. And I also do that to honor all of your different identities and how they're intersecting with all of you as you're hearing and interacting right with this work this evening. I have a few slides that I am going to display here in a minute. It's about 30 minutes of presentation, and then afterwards I'm looking forward to our question and answer session. I won't be able to see the chat as we're going along, so if you have questions or comments, I won't be able to see them until I'm done with my slides, but I look forward to engaging with them after I'm done with the presentation. So without further ado, finding the words. So our plot for today is to go through literature as healing, and then experiencing my life as a queer Armenian. So that will be some personal narrative, and then getting into the searching. So what did it take? What was it like to start to put this library together? And then acknowledging the various stories, right, that were happening, that I was interacting with finding all of these different books and short stories and poetry and film and music. And then the reconnecting part, which I want to just dive into here around what am I talking about when I say literature as healing? I'm going to read a few passages from my essay, The Words, and it really hopefully will begin to highlight why I was, or where I was at rather, when I started to put together this library. Do you know that Armenia is not even how we say Armenia in Armenian? I said, slurring my words to some gay friends at a hookah lounge, doling out stories about my Armenian family. It's HAYASTAN. How do you pronounce it? HAYASTAN. All those stan countries are so backwards, one friend said, patting my knee. Afghanistan, Pakistan, HAYASTAN. You're better off living here, he continued, in the same tone of voice that I imagined a kind editor would use as she advised a writer to put the manuscript away. There's nothing there, let it go. But I didn't. I wanted the right words, written in the right way, to describe what was happening to me in the ambiguous spaces of conjunctions and hyphens, queer and Armenian American. Who will save this boy? My pastor appealed to his 300-person congregation. My adolescent body sat perched on a stool next to his pulpit. The pastor had chosen me as his symbol of the universal boy, innocent, vulnerable. He swung his hand in the air, doubling down on his challenge. Who will save this boy from the temptations of the world? Drugs, alcohol, lust, pornography, and deviance. Who will stand for him? I squirmed. My eyes bugged. There was a ripple of stifled laughter from some young men. Out of all the boys in the youth group, why had the pastor plucked me out? Was my femininity his subtext? Bob rose from his pew, my father, and I writhed. This had been pre-planned. The pastor plastered his words on me, a public lesson in front of God. The next time you think of lust, pornography, and deviance, think of JP. Script in hand, Bob declared, I will stand for him. Don't tell anyone you're gay, Miriam, my mother demanded. I dropped my suitcase and myself onto the guest bed of my grandmother's apartment. It had taken 2 planes and 2 trains to haul me from Minnesota to Valence, France, for a visit with my extended Armenian family. Miriam rose to her full height, all 5 feet and 1 inch of it, to claim her maternal power of censorship. I already have enough shit to deal with. At a work conference in Washington, D.C., I decided I might be ready to look for other queer Armenians. I was 34, after all. I propped myself up on the hotel bed and typed 2 words into Google: gay Armenians. I braced myself for hostility and the possibility of a rogue LGBTQ-friendly op-ed published in an American newspaper, since obviously the Armenian newspapers would have rejected it. The first result was the Hyphen magazine, an online publication founded and written by queer Armenians. Next, there was an op-ed by Vahan Tekeyan in the Armenian Weekly. Then there was the website for the Los Angeles-based Gay and Lesbian Armenian Society, or GALLUS. I rolled my eyes. Where was GALLUS when I had lived in Los Angeles? I clicked through their website and Facebook page. There were photos of grinning Armenians. GALLUS hosted social events, speakers, fundraisers. They had links to culturally competent health services for LGBTQ Armenians. I pushed my laptop off me. Where had GALLUS been when I lived there? I grabbed the remote and flipped through television channels. I walked to the vending machines. With my index finger, I stabbed the buttons. The strawberry Pop-Tarts dropped. I punched my hand through the slot door, harder than intended. Package in hand, I stared down the empty hallway. Why hadn't they rescued me? It was a childish complaint, but potent. If they were organized, then why didn't they come find me? Why hadn't they been like the wizards of Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea, the possessors of secret knowledge, seeking out gifted boys, spiriting them away to the island of Rope to learn a magic based on knowing the true words, the true names of all the living things in the world, so that they can reestablish balance to the universe. I meandered back to my room, sat on the edge of my bed, and watched an episode of Girls. I couldn't tell if I was angry with GALLUS or with myself for hiding so well that the idea of a queer Armenian organization was a bridge too far for my imagination. I broke the strawberry Pop-Tarts into pieces, grinding them in my mouth into a thick paste. It was difficult to swallow. As Tatevik said, I am an equity and inclusion officer working in higher education and previously with healthcare systems throughout the Midwest. I found, as you can see a little bit there, a part of my personal narrative was dealing with a lot of trauma related to a variety of things, but also being queer and also wrestling with what it meant to deal with historical trauma from grandparents and great-grandparents who were genocide survivors. I used this model in my work, and it really informed how I was approaching the library and also what I got out of the library. And so you can see her on this slide, and I'm not going to go into the details of it, but there's a cycle of violence here. So you see in the red a traumatic event, and what you see around that right circle there are various experiences that a person can have after a traumatic event. There can be a flight freeze response, shock, injury, feelings of powerlessness and helplessness, anger, spiritual questions, loss of meaning, suppression of grief and fears, survivor guilt, shame, and humiliation. At various points in my life, I was going through these things to various degrees. But then you see on the left-hand side that there are the acting out, right? So on the right, you're experiencing things as a trauma survivor or experiencing trauma on a regular basis. And then that can lead to acting out behaviors, embracing us versus them identities, dehumanizing the other, developing very clear good versus evil narratives, viewing violence as redemptive, responding to social and cultural pressures, attacking in this name of self-defense, justice, or honor. And I found myself doing a variety of those actions as well as I was trying to navigate what does this mean, this queer identity and this Armenian American identity. And what I was looking for, even though I didn't know it at the time, was this model, right? So you see the circles there and the dashed lines. And what's important about that is you have the cycles, but then you have this breaking free moment. And this breaking free moment is really about finding safety and support. And I don't think, for some folks, they may be like, who is this person who waited until their mid-30s to start looking for other queer Armenians? Like, it doesn't make sense that he or they would think, oh, well, they're really the only one on the planet who's queer and Armenian American. That was my lived experience up until then. And it wasn't until I found my current relationship with Jim and Gordy that I was able to find the safety and the support to really begin to dive in to what I've been experiencing, what I even hadn't let my brain consider or acknowledge. And so where I find the Queer Armenian Library is getting to is that acknowledgement stage. There is a naming and a confronting of fears, there's memorializing, and there's reflection on root causes, right, of experiences, of acknowledging multiple stories. And so that's where, into my mid-30s, that's the model here. I want you to locate my personal narrative right within this, recognizing that that is my personal narrative. It is clearly not the experiences of all queer Armenians. And that's something that you'll see, hopefully, as we're going through what is in the library. So when you're searching for a diaspora within a diaspora, right, you have queer Armenians who are very much all across the planet. One author that I got to speak with Olivia Katranjian, the founder of the International Armenian Literary Alliance, we interviewed Arlene Voskiavakian last year. And as we were walking through what was in the library and talking to her experiences, she paused at one point and she said, I never thought that I would ever be talking about queer Armenian literature. And that underscored for me the isolated nature of folks who are spread out across the world, not just in HAYASTAN and Artsakh, but literally across the world, the US, Canada, Europe, South America, etc. And so when you're trying to find them, how do you do that, right? There is no bookstore. There was at the time no existing library. There was no website that fundamentally had all of the works that I was hoping would exist out there. And so in 2016, it really did start in that hotel room in Washington, DC, with a Google search, gay and Armenians. And what popped up were two things, actually, the Hyphen magazine, and then a remarkable resource. It is a blog spot called Unzipped Gay Armenia. And this is the longest running blog. It started in the mid-aughts, continuing through today. It is a remarkable resource, and it was a treasure trove. I found so many different items in there. As the blogger Mika went through and did reviews on books, on films that Mika saw was coming out, and so that was a really remarkable resource. And I do recommend, if you get a chance to check out that blog. I hope that it's going to be archived in a way that it can be accessible beyond, God forbid, if Mika decides to close down the blog. From there, that moved into, starting to go through the newspapers, Armenian Weekly, the Mirror Spectator, going through a real bookstore, literally using every search term that I could come up with, right? Like lesbian and Armenian, gay and Armenian, bisexual and Armenian, transgender and Armenian, pansexual Armenian, like any combination of words I was putting into every search engine that I could find there. And what was great about a real bookstore is that not only did they have queer titles, but they actually had a searchable website, which there were other Armenian bookstores that didn't have searchable websites, which was frustrating. From there, it moved into any search engine that I could find, right? Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Google Books, A-Books, Thrift Books. Thrift Books is amazing. It catalogs all the thrift stores in the United States can upload the titles that they have in their various stores. You can go to this website, you can use your search terms, and then you can find, and figure out, oh, it's this, it's this thrift store in, California or Arkansas or, New York that has this book, please send it to me. From there, it went into the academia side of things. So Academic Search Premier, JSTOR, Google Scholar, a new organization, Equality Armenia, started putting out really fantastic articles. And then Twitter and Instagram became really important sources of information as well. Like literally last week, I was added to a group on Twitter of queer Armenians, and literally within like 5 minutes of being there, found a photographer whose photos I'm going to share with you in a minute. And then since the library went live last fall, what's actually been great and what I was hoping for is that there are submission pages on the website. So if you're a artist, a writer, a filmmaker, you can submit to me what you have produced, your artwork, your literature, and I can upload it from there. Or if you're an individual who isn't a writer, artist, or filmmaker, you can let me know about something, right, that exists as well. And so all of the updates that actually went live last Wednesday, all of those came through the website submissions. And then this entire process, I will probably start going through all over again at the end of the year so that I can continue to find new works. And hopefully this time, though, it'll be more of a partnership of folks knowing that it's a resource and wanting to add to it as well. So I do need to recognize these digital pioneers. Unzipped, Gallus, Equality Armenian Magazine, they were organizing in the digital space, which I think is important on a couple of reasons. One, the internet was really a place for all of us who are spread out across the globe to actually come together and find each other. But also there's another dynamic of that, and that the internet provides a level of anonymity, right? You can just go to Hyphen's website, Equality Armenia's website, and you can just read. You can view things there. And I think that's really important when folks are at various different stages, like I was, and actually continue to be as I work out what exactly is this identity and putting these together of what it can mean to be queer and Armenian. So as I was going along, I was not expecting to find things from the early 20th century. I had come to the conclusion that if any queer Armenians existed, I would only learn about folks more recently and that their histories would have been erased. And it comes to find out, no, not so much. So Yegishe Charents, his story is fascinating in that before he was arrested, he hid a bunch of his papers. And folks here, you might already know this, but for folks who don't know this story, he hid a bunch of his papers and he entrusted it to a friend. And those papers didn't come out until the late 20th century. And then from there, an academic in the United States found those papers and then worked to get them translated and discovered that a lot of his unpublished work and his published work had very homoerotic themes to them. And that today, Yegishe may identify as bisexual, he may identify as gay or pansexual. There was definitely a hidden aspect, right, to his sexuality that he felt he couldn't necessarily disclose at the time. And since then, unfortunately, has been erased. There's a little known novel, An Anglo-American Alliance, written by Gregory Kasparian. It's his only work. He wrote it after immigrating to the United States. It was published, I think, in 1907. It is a sci-fi novel. And what's great about it is that he led the way in terms of representation in science fiction. And I had no idea about this, that he depicted the first lesbian romance in a positive light. And that didn't happen again for decades before other sci-fi authors were willing to go there. And so he was really a pioneer, right, in this work. In the upper right-hand corner, you see a photo from Mariam Sahinyan. And I just learned about her work. She, from the Twitter group that I was just added to. So she did a lot of, her style was portrait style, and she did feature trans and queer subjects in her work. Unfortunately, I've only been able to find 14 photos, and largely those came from a New York Times profile of her from a few years back. I do, in her page on the library, include links to a variety of articles, to newspaper profiles, and then the New York Times profile, where you can see that gallery of her portrait work. But this was really trailblazing because Sahinyan was the first woman as well to have a professional photography studio in the Ottoman Empire and Turkey in the early 20th century. So she was not only a pioneer in terms of her, in terms of being a woman in photography in Turkey, but then also took that extra step to be very inclusive of the folks that she photographed. And then, of course, there's Vahan Tekeyan, whose poetry, I don't think I'll ever really quite be able to put into words what his poetry meant to me. When I read this particular poem, Your Name, why can't I write your name upon this page and declare to the world how I loved you? In secret, I whisper its 2 syllables, and it seems to me a rare book of love. Why can't I write your name upon this page? So many of his poems, the first time I read them, I was like, get out of my brain. Like, how did he know this, right? It was really striking to me that this exemplar poet from Armenia from 100 years ago was writing verses that, if I had been a poet in a different dimension and time, would be words that I would have hoped to have written. And I can go back here. The edition right there, Sacred Wrath, translated by Diana Derhovanesian and Marfed Margosian. That's a really great edition, and I highly recommend it because you get the English translations and the original Armenian poetry. As we proceed then into the late 20th century, so Sergei Parajanov, his films being a bisexual man, clear themes I think that we would recognize today as either camp or just really groundbreaking in how he's presenting, right, gender and sexuality in his film work, and also having been arrested, right, for quote sexual deviancy by the Soviet Union. Later, though, as you get into the later 20th century, there's Parajanov's work, and then there is George Stambolian and Arlene Bosky-Avakian. Avakian really paved the way in a number of instances. One, she wrote the first memoir as a just Armenian American woman, and then the first memoir as a lesbian Armenian American. And her memoir is so important because, again, as I was reading it, I thought, goodness, again, another person from a different generation writing things that I've been experiencing, writing things that are like, wow, this is something that, if I could write down, these are things that I would have written. And then George Stambolian, an Armenian American, a pioneer, right, in writing for the gay magazine Christopher Street, collecting, as you can see on the screen there, highly regarded anthology series called Men on Men, where he curated a bunch of new gay fiction from established writers, but also creating a platform for new and emerging, aspiring gay fiction writers. And in this one on the screen there, Men on Men 3, he wrote what I understand, and as far as I know, is the only story of his that specifically engages with a gay Armenian American character. It's a short story. It's called In My Father's Car, and here's an excerpt from it. As for me, the evidence is clear. I am beginning to look like my father. And now that he is dying, my metamorphosis has accelerated. He seems to be hurling his traits at me in a mad effort to guarantee their survival, or something in me is sucking them from him against his will. The story is about, he was the main character, was born in the United States. His father was born in Armenia, in the Ottoman Empire, and he's navigating taking his father to the hospital. That's why they're in his father's car, and he's noticing all of these, good-looking men as he's doing that, our main character, but then also trying to navigate what does it mean to be in the new world and inheriting this cultural tradition, but then how does that manifest itself being a second-generation son to a first-generation immigrant in the United States. It's a really fascinating short story. And then, of course, Arlene's memoir, I didn't believe that I would ever live within an Armenian community. She asked why with such sincerity that I responded honestly. I said I could not live my life as an adult woman within the confines of an Armenian community where there was no room for me to be who I am. To my surprise, she said she knew what I meant, but she did not elaborate. That particular passage was really profound to me in the sense that I did have to leave the Armenian community or put very boundary relationships with the Armenian community before I could really begin to dive into what it meant to be queer and Armenian. And here was Arlene, you know, in 1992, paved the way, and her memoir really set the template for future memoirists in this field of writing about queer Armenian American, or just queer and Armenian rather, identities. Whether those folks realize I read her memoir or not, it's really remarkable about how her memoir holds up as that template. And it was just translated into Turkish for the first time last year. It's been published in multiple languages, which is really amazing, and it should be held up all these years later. The organizers. So the folks here on this page are really amazing writers, groundbreaking writers, but also notable in the sense that they were organizing queer Armenians and creating queer Armenian spaces. And so I really want to honor that. I think that she is on the call today, Nancy Agabian. Her memoir, Me Is Her Again, and her collection of performance pieces and poetry that was published in the late 90s, if I remember correctly. It's called Princess Freak. I mean, Nancy is prolific, and I adore Nancy, and Nancy's my hero. But also what is remarkable to me is how she organizes people, both in Yerevan, in Armenia, how she, in her writing as an instructor, coaches writers, teaches writers, but also even this past January, in an event with Gallus online, was working through literature as healing, right? So working through writing prompts with participants, and having that organizing space to be together in a room where you don't have to explain what it means to be queer and Armenian. You can just start writing and know that folks are with you, right, with that space, regardless of whether you're wanting to be a professional writer or if you're just writing as a healing instrument. Queered, What's to Be Done with Eccentric Art. Fascinating document, not just document. What I mean by that is that there's so much in there: photography, poetry, even a whole trail of email correspondences between the organizers and editors of this book about what it should look like. The Queer in Yerevan collective operates within Yerevan. They're very prolific. They do not just writing and photography, but a lot of activism within Yerevan itself. This is just one of their projects, and I really, their website is linked from the library, and I really encourage you to find ways to support them, because obviously the conditions within Armenia itself are very different than they are within the various diasporas, and their work is really crucial. And several of those folks were involved in, you can see there on the right, the Armenian Review. This is the first collection of queering Armenian studies as an academic text that, as far as I'm aware, exists. And it is a really fascinating piece of work, and was really important in not only adding to queer Armenian literature, but adding to the academic literature as well. Nancy, I'm going to quote something from your memoir. So bear with me if I read this wrong. I could have kept these histories, these personal stories, some might say selfish, self-centered stories to myself, solid in the knowledge that I had grown. But then I would be betraying another inheritance from my mother and my grandmother to speak the truth, not merely for the satisfaction of oneself, but because it is the right thing to do. Nancy's memoir was one of the first that I got to. And when I read that, and when I started to realize that I might have the most comprehensive collection of titles and books and films, I thought I should probably start putting this together in a way that folks, if they want to put in gay and Armenian into a Google search, this library would come up and they could find their people. There are 3 young adult novels. I love these young adult novels. I wish I would have had all 3 of them as a kid. And what I love about them is that they are unabashedly optimistic, unabashed about it. And it is about love, and it is about the crises, if you will, that drive these plot points are not about shame, are not about the stigma of being queer and Armenian. which I find fascinating, that it's the young adult novels that are taking this particular point of view and have this aesthetic. It's about love, and it's not stigmatized in that in a negative sense, which I think is really important for young queer Armenians to have this space, even if it's fiction. I don't mean that in a negative way, because fiction is very important in terms of imagination and realizing what is possible in the world. And so I think it's super important, not just for queer Armenian youth, but also for adults. I mean, I read One Man Guy as a in my mid-30s, and it broke my heart that I didn't have that novel when I was a kid, because it is optimistic and positive, and hopefully will be groundbreaking in what we will continue to see, not only in fiction, but in how queer Armenian kids are living their lives. Kissing Ethan. Kissing Ethan rocked. Kissing Ethan was sweet like the last piece of baklava drenched in honey, snatched from the bottom of the box. Kissing Ethan was the answer to an unasked prayer. That is a quote from Hold My Hand, Michael Barakiva's second young adult novel, and overall the third young adult novel featuring a gay Armenian protagonist. There's some really fascinating literature from HAYASTAN itself, for some really fantastic authors. And what I find remarkable, not remarkable like in a it couldn't be done sense, but remarkable in a excited sense, is how the authors from Armenia, the writers, are really experimental, really looking at form critically and how it can create space of activism, space of liberation, and spaces of exploring identities in really new ways. Fleeting City is it's a fantastic novel. It took me a couple times to get through it, because it is like watching a patchwork of imagery and sensations and sounds just moving through the pages. Has this very surrealistic aspect to it. It's really fascinating. And then on the left there, ARMEN of Armenia, which is a pen name, a writing name for Armen Ohanyan. This is from his story of the return of Kikos, a short story. For a long time, I had been looking for somebody to tell the real story of my life, and I found him at last. His name is Armen, and he is the author of these lines. We don't get along very well together. And what's great about that, there's this short story that many of you may know, The Death of Kikos, a traditional story in Armenian culture. And what's great about that is how he doesn't rewrite, but how he engages with that original story and writes the return of Kikos, but then also how he decenters himself, right? And he has this main character talking about him, the author, right? It's this really fascinating way, which I appreciate, of how it, again, using imagination to liberate, which was really important for me as I was beginning to reconcile these two identities of where are those spaces that we can break free. The memoirists, here are 3 groundbreaking memoirs. I was really sad. Baba Avian passed away about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And when I was reading the obituaries and the comments online, particularly on Twitter, nobody knew that he was Armenian American. And that was really sad to me. And so I kept reposting his posts wherever I could, his post from the library, because he was this giant on Broadway as a choreographer, working with big stars like Katharine Hepburn, and did big productions in London and on Broadway. And it's really frustrating, right, that he was experiencing whatever he was experiencing. He did mention and talk about his family and how they immigrated to the United States and how they were Armenian, and a little bit about their background. But that erasure and also that stigma, it makes me wonder what he went through, that he felt that he had to make that break, right? And even in changing his last name to make it sound right, more English sounding. Chaz Bono, right, the son of Cher, wrote the first trans memoir as someone of Armenian descent, and then quickly followed later by Chris Edwards' memoir, which I love the title, Balls It Takes Some to Get Some. And I really recommend his memoir, Chris's memoir, for a number of reasons. One is that I use it in my own professional work when someone wants to understand what a gender affirmation and transition can look like, because he puts it all out on the page. And it's also really interesting how he navigates having his entire family's name is Eskandarian, the surname. And it's really interesting how he navigates transitioning from Chris Eskandarian to Chris Edwards. So I highly recommend it on a number of levels. And I'll quote from it. I was born a Taurus and a perfectionist, which meant I was willing to go through whatever it would take to get myself the closest thing to a fully functioning biological penis. I wanted to pee standing up. I wanted to be able to have intercourse, to feel what it's like to be inside a woman. I wanted all those things that most genetic men take for granted. I imagine, and I can just imagine my family, the Armenian side in particular, would be furious at me right now for reading that out loud and quoting that particular passage from Chris's memoir. But I really think that it's important to do so, and it's very brave, and it's a wonderful read, and I hope that it begins to expand our knowledge of what gender affirmation is and can be in the Armenian American community. What I was not expecting were the filmmakers. Wasn't expecting that at all. There's a bunch of filmmakers, both Armenian and not, that are including queer Armenian characters or whose characters are interacting positively with queer Armenian characters. And there's a couple of, there's even a TV show actually in Russia that a web series that just launched last fall. And then when the library launched, they reached out to me to say that it was going, and it's in Russian, but it's on YouTube. So the closed captioning is actually pretty decent, or at least I assume it's decent. I don't actually speak Russian, so I'm hopeful that it is decent translation work. But I do want to share, actually, I think we're going over on time. So I'm actually going to skip past these trailers, but I do want to point out Pink Armenia, their documentary, Listen to Me, is really important because it follows, oh goodness, 10 or 12 queer folks in Armenia, and they are telling their stories of what it's like to be LGBTQ and living in Armenia. And it's a really powerful documentary. It's just over an hour long. And if you get the opportunity to watch it, please do. And then also please share it on your various networks. A lot of the things that I hope with this library is that things come out and then it's like, okay, well, that it came out and then it kind of goes by the wayside, right? And so, what I'm also hopeful with the library is that a lot of these works will be rediscovered and continue to be shared across the world. So again, I want to come back to this model of what does this library, right, mean for me, and what I hope it means for folks who come to it. Obviously, there's the acknowledgement part of things, but then in the beginning part of reconnection, and before you even get to reconnection, you have to acknowledge, you have to memorialize, you have to name fears, you have to accept losses, you have to grieve what needs to be grieved. You have to go through that. I think a lot of folks want to jump ahead, or to the reconnection part of things, or they want to continue to erase things and not mention things. We saw this most clearly, most recently, with the new presidential administration in the United States. The Biden administration has appointed 2 gay Armenian men, gay Armenian American men, to his administration. And what's wild is how the pushback is around erasing that part of their identities, not mentioning it. And when it does get mentioned, it's, well, why did you mention it? It doesn't matter that they're gay. Like, don't talk about that, right? So it's really important, the acknowledgement phase, but that can lead then to creating healthy boundaries. It can lead to listening and building trust, which I feel those phases between acknowledgement and moving into reconnection is where I hope the library takes us, and what the library, right, has done for me. Well, I'm gonna finish on this thought before I have my concluding thought. So the reconnecting part, I really want to highlight the International Armenian Literary Alliance. My website at the library could have just been that. It could have been a library. And Olivia, the founder, reached out to me, and she was so great because she said, I want there to be overlap. I want there to be partnership. She was like, I want there to be a queer literature department. And so she's been having conversations with a variety of folks, including Nancy Agabian, around what could that look like to have a queer department within Yala itself, and what are the readings that we can host, and what are the panels, and how can we bring writers together? Writers who, many of whom have expressed to me, I've just been writing by myself. I didn't know there were other people that I could, give a draft of things to, or I could talk to them about drafts or films that I was working on. So that networking part of things as well. And then obviously the promotion side of things. But I wanna stop sharing that as part of my concluding thoughts. I know I've gone long here, but for me personally, what this library has accomplished is 10 years ago would never have done anything like this. One, I never would have thought that this would have been possible for an organization like the Armenian Institute to invite somebody like me to talk about this particular topic like that. No, my imagination wouldn't have been possible. But also I wouldn't have been literally able to do it. My anxiety would have been so great. I would have been so worried about who is going to be on the call. Is this really going to be on YouTube? Who's going to come after me? It took me a while, even with my therapist, to kind of walk through, like, am I ready to have a contact me section on the Queer Armenian Library website? Like, am I in a space where I can handle that in the event that trolls start to come at me? And I really, need to acknowledge, yes, there was that work that I needed to do on myself, but that work wouldn't have been possible without these books and films and photography. And that's really important. And that's why I hope the library goes to next, is that friends and family members can share this with folks. I just literally had someone reach out to me a week ago after the new titles were added, and said, my dad shared this with me. And it made me tear up a little bit, because I was like, I'm jealous that your dad would do that for you. But also, like, wow, we're at that space. We're at that level now where that can happen, where it's not shut down, where a dad can say, hey, do you know about this over here? And so I want to thank you. I'll conclude on that thought, that I really hope and thank you for having this particular event. And while, yes, it's my project, I hope that, and I'm here today as your speaker, it's really bigger than that. And I hope that comes through, that this isn't about me. It's about the queer loved ones we have in our lives. And it's about these artists and these writers that we need to hold up, because they have value that's not just about being a queer Armenian. Yes, that those stories and those narratives need to be told, but they have a lot to share with us about the Armenian experience, about the diaspora experience, about being queer people from Southwest Asian countries, Swana countries, and from the Middle East. There's lots of organizing that can happen there as well. So thank you for holding this up, and I hope that you continue to do that in the future. And please, this is not from a selfish point at all, please share the library with your networks, because at the end of the day, you might not know who you're saving by doing that. So I'll stop talking and take questions or comments.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope you can see everyone uploading in their little windows, and I can see lots of overwhelmed and smiling faces, and I'm sure I speak for everyone. And I say big thank you for this beautiful creation of yours. It would take lots of time, lots of courage. We were chatting with JP just before we started about difficulties of creating the library, and you said resizing the pictures was the most difficult part in very typical likeness. But most of all, it's moving to see how much love has gone into it. Everyone, every person you spoke about, there was so much love in your voice. It's really humbling and touching. So thank you very much for creating this. Before our friends start asking their questions, I'll ask a quick question myself to jump on this chance. What amazes me in your library, how wide your range is. You have Polsetsy photographers from a century ago, you have contemporary Armenian writers, you have Sean Baker's films, you have contemporary publications. How do you select them? What's the criteria? Do you have certain test of quality, queerness you have to pass?
That's a great question. So if the author identifies as queer, and I'm using queer as the umbrella term, right? So if they identify as lesbian, bisexual, trans, pansexual, asexual, questioning, bigender, gender, non-binary, etc. If they identify in any way like that, and also of being Armenian descent, then absolutely they are in the library. If the work has a character who is also queer and Armenian, then I will put them in right as well. So there's a novel. I find some of it problematic, but there is a novel from Alexander Vidal Porto. He's a Brazilian author, an LGBTQ activist who wrote a novel about a trans woman. So the novel on the website is called Sergio Y. And so that's an example of a writer who's not Armenian, but included one of the main characters was a trans Armenian woman in the text. So that goes in. And then the other part of it is which is an exclusion. If the work is negative or stigmatizing in any way, then I don't include it. There's enough forums to deal with that, and I think folks get that in their daily lives. So I deliberately exclude anything that is negative.
Thank you. That's interesting. That's very methodical as well. It's amazing that behind something so exciting, there's such a strict method, and your website is very methodical, well organized. And if you haven't seen it, please go and have a look at it. I'll guarantee you'll spend a few good hours there. I know that JP, by the way, there are huge numbers of thank yous and compliments going in the chat. I will save it all for you and send it to lots of love coming to your direction. I know Nick has a question for you.
Yes. Firstly, just wanted to add my thanks to Tato. That was a really beautiful, beautiful presentation. And as friends are saying in the chat, comes from so much trauma, but also so much healing. And as a Baiman myself with heritage in the region, Cypriot heritage, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And I just want to say to friends with us that they can put their questions into the chat, or if you'd like to, you can use the hand function to ask JP your question yourself. So please do. It'd be great to hear from more people. But in the meantime, while people are coming up with their questions, I wanted to ask what kind of conversations your project has started with people in HAYASTAN and Artsakh itself. I remember when I was there, the most difficult, I want to say conversation, but it was a bit more harsh than that, that I had was about trans identities in particular, but more queer identities in general. And one of the contexts that really enforced itself here, and I was completely thrown by, was the way in which the person I was arguing with wasn't really wasn't really denying the legitimacy of the identity itself, but saying that somehow if there was space given for queer identities, that this then would somehow negatively impact the ability to struggle with Azerbaijan, to keep Artsakh, and all of these things that I just really didn't, they suddenly came in from left field and really threw me. And so I was wondering what sort of conversations you'd had with people, what connections you'd been making. Yeah, it's a very broad question, but I just like everyone else, I've just enjoyed hearing your stories so much that I want to hear a few more.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Those conversations with me involved with them are very, very much in the beginning stages. Only because just getting, like, I can know of a person, but I don't necessarily have their contact information, right? And so through this, I've been starting to get some contact information of folks who are living in HAYASTAN and Artsakh. The next stage of that for me, for me, those conversations are very, very much in the beginning. My goal is, in partnership, hopefully with Yala, but also with other organizations, is how can those dialogues begin to happen more intentionally, where we can, there's some great work that needs to be translated from Armenian into English. A Brill bookstore, Arno, he reached out to me and he said, do you know about these books in Armenian and these writers that are over there? Christopher Atamian, he just sent me his novel, which I've seen an excerpt of in English. Unfortunately, I don't read Armenian. And I was like, we got to find a translator for this. And so, but then also vice versa, like what of things that are in English that need to be translated right over there. And so those conversations do need to happen. For me, and in this space, they're very much in their nascent stages. So
I guess
more details at 11.
One question then that's come in, but I guess you just answered it, is whether you've had a chance to reach out to the feminist library in Armenia.
No, not yet.
Maybe Tato, I know there was another question that you wanted to ask as well.
Yes, very probably an obvious one. You talked about how you prepared yourself to the responses to the library. How it's been? Was it what you expected? What sort of response? Because I've just seen only the positive side. That was an eye roll.
No, I was. There's in behavioral health. There's a particularly working with folks who have undergone trauma, a phenomenon called hypervigilance, where you're just always on guard for the attack, right? Whether it's going to be physical or emotional or spiritual, you're just waiting for it. And I feel like I was in a very hyper vigilant space last fall, as I was realizing, okay, this is going to go live. Here we go. Do I want to have submissions or contact forms on the website? You can tell I turned off all commenting. There's no ability to put any comments on any of the pages. So I was ready for it, and with the exception of like a handful of negative comments, there hasn't been any negativity. It's all been like overwhelmingly positive, which I think also speaks to where we're at today, that there are, and maybe it's just my corner of Armenian Twitter that it's all been so positive, and maybe the trolls just are not willing to come to the site and put in their comment forms. But when the Armenian Weekly article came out last week, I said, I'm not reading the comments. And so one of my partners, Jimmy's like, well, I'll read the comments. And I'm like, you can read them, but I am not responding to them. And he was like, they're fine. They're fine. There's only 2 anyway. And I was like, really? There's only 2? Because even then I was in my brain was preparing for all of the like, who is this guy? And he's not Armenian and da 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 da. So I've been really pleasantly both surprised and affirmed that the community has been so welcoming. And I want to say communities, because there's the Armenian community in Glendale, Boston, New York, Midwestern Armenian community in England. So it's been really positive. And what I also like about is watching the statistics, right? And watching the map and how pretty consistent it's been since November when it launched. And I can pull up that. What I love about WordPress is that they color the map pink. I don't know why they chose the color pink, but I think it's just appropriate. So the darker shade of pink in a country shows you where folks are coming to visit the library. And it's the map is literally every continent has pink on it, which has been, I was like thinking maybe Armenia, maybe North America, maybe some folks, and I was expecting folks from England. I was hoping folks from England would engage, right? Because it's in English, but it, all across the globe, folks have been looking at it, and it's been consistently that way. So I've been really happy about that. But again, I want to decenter. It's not just about me being happy about that and prepared. I'm just really happy that these authors and writers and filmmakers are getting this exposure as well.
Fantastic. It's wonderful to hear. I've enjoyed seeing it grow even in this short period of time. And maybe you're changing a few troll minds. Hopefully they'll disappear. We have a question. Nancy, would you like to ask the question yourself? Because JP mentioned you so much.
Sure. Hi, JP. That was great. I really enjoyed hearing about the project so personally because I hadn't heard it before. And yeah, I'm really honored that my work could have some place in it, especially in healing and that idea of speaking the truth, like getting all these stories out there. It's just an incredible platform, and you just need to be so credited for all this work. I also didn't realize you did in the span of 5 years. That's incredible. So my question was, well, one thing I really love about the library is how you built it with the idea that it could grow. So you were thinking in this forward way. And I loved looking and seeing the new page with all the new submissions and learning about all this work. So I was curious about your curation and, also wondering how you conceived of the individual pages, and then wondering moving forward what help you need or would want to keep it going, to sustain it and maintain it.
Those are great questions. Thank you, Nancy. For the pages themselves, the formatting, it's the same formatting on every page. So I introduce the title and who the artist, writer, filmmaker is. And then as much as I'm able to, I try to locate it within firsts and seconds, which there's a lot of in Western culture, this idea of that you're the first to do something, right? And that's given a lot of credit, which I don't like, because if you're the second and third in doing this, that's just as valuable, right? Even more so, right? That we need more of these. We don't just need one young adult novel, we need more of these. And so I try, but the reason why I want to highlight that is to kind of underscore how a lot of this is new. The Baba Avian's memoir in 2020 was the first one written by a gay man of Armenian descent. I find that fascinating, and I find that fascinating for a reason. Very much so in the West, gay cis men have kind of they've had more access to publishing, they've had more access to positions of power, and by power I mean leading organizations, some of them that really well and have advanced the cause for everybody and striving for equity, and then some of them not so much. But what's interesting to me here is how women have led queer Armenian literature, and almost every facet of it, how they have been at the forefront of it, which is really, really interesting to me. And so that when I put in those firsts or seconds, I also want to kind of highlight the people who were at the forefront, who were innovating, who were imagining, and were ahead of the curve, which, Nancy, you were on multiple levels. You were doing that work, and were in some instances revolutionary in doing that. So that's one way of doing it. I try to include the bios. I try to include some sort of multimedia. What I mean by that is if there's a podcast or an interview or some sort of video lecture, because there's the work, but I like attaching sounds to faces. So as much as possible, if there is some sort of audio or video of the author or the artist, I try to include that as well. The front of and this is just design stuff, the front page, what I want it to do is to be random, so that every time you go to the front page, it's not the same. So ideally you can see something new every time you land there. But the design part of me, because I used all those rainbow colored blocks, I don't like it when a purple sits on a purple or a blue sits on a blue or an orange sits on an orange. It drives it. I can't handle it. So I turned that off, that function. And I got to figure out in the next iteration of the site, which I can't believe I'm already thinking of the next design features. But that will be that'll be something that I want to look at, because I would love for folks to come to the site and every time they get there, they see something new when they arrive. But the curation model that I said earlier, if someone identifies as any part of the queer community and of Armenian descent, or if they write about having a queer Armenian character in there, and so long as it isn't negative, those works will go into the library. Academic stuff is the next part. That's a lot more. You can't render that visually. There's no book cover, on a dissertation or a master's thesis, but there's actually a lot of good stuff that's coming out of this. I got to figure out how to represent that and have better access to folks who aren't in academia to know that exists and maybe track it down through their own libraries. So that'll be another component to it. From there, I'm not quite sure. This is going to be an evolution, like what I need, like it's there right now. And I will continue to update it on when I get a critical mass of stuff. I wish I had the time to update it on someone gives me a title and I can turn around and do it right away. It's kind of, okay, here it is, like let's get everything together and then it'll go live. So maybe if someone wants to help with that, that'd be great. Then we could just do it on a as it goes along. Though I do kind of, again, this is just the showman in me. I do kind of like the idea of like pulling everything together and going, hey, all new, brand new stuff in February. So I'm not quite sure. As you can tell, it's a work in progress and I haven't quite figured it all out in my head yet.
Thanks. So we have another question from Anna, who was asking if you've found a particular challenge, or maybe the writers you've been working with found a particular challenge in translating certain words from queer terminology to Armenian. Maybe whether there are barriers in the socio-linguistic structure of Armenian that makes it difficult to find equivalent words, but although Anna does note underneath that Armenian is actually a gender-neutral language, although that didn't stop when I was learning Eastern Armenian, them only having the version of secretary with the uhi ending. But yes, have you found these sorts of issues pop up?
On a side note on the pronouns, if I could, in my professional work, I would actually prefer to use Armenian pronouns as my pronouns. But so much of myself is so complicated anyway to Midwesterners that I'm like, we'll just use he, him, or they, them for now. Like, I would love to have a genderless pronoun, but English, and I don't want to get into more arguments with the English faculty. I have done because I don't read and write Armenian to a level where I could do translation work, so I don't haven't engaged to that level. What I do want to point out though is that Queering Yerevan, both in the What's to Be Done, Queered What's to Be Done with Eccentric Art, and on their website, really dive into the Western notion of queer and the English definition of that, and then how it can be translated into Armenian. So one word that they use is darorinag. Wait, I think that's the Western Armenian saying of it. It might be tarorinak. And then they want to turn that into a verb. And so there's a really interesting what they have on their website about, they don't feel that queer should be an identity. What they need it to be is a verb as part of activism and creating spaces of liberation, which I think is really fascinating. And that I haven't seen that level of engagement around translation per se in West, in English, folks who are writing in the States or Canada or the UK, which I think is really interesting. And probably because, I don't know, maybe those folks don't have the same level of Armenian that I do. But that translation part of things, I think there is that area is really ripe for more work. And Queering Yerevan is there, and then that in Queered What's to Be Done with Eccentric Art, they're there. They're looking at that whole book is about translation, which is why it's both in Armenian and English. So it's I really recommend it I think that one would be the one I would recommend first to diving into the nuances of English versus Armenian, not versus, but what happens in that ambiguous space of translation. Also, on another pronounced part, and with all due respect to the editors of the Sacred Wrath, Diana Derhovanesian, which I feel like is I can't believe I'm putting any critique on her at all, but in the introduction, they try to explain away the rumors of Vahan Tekeyan's sexuality by saying that, well, the pronouns in Armenian are gender neutral, so we'll never know. So that's just one little thing that I get annoyed about.
I would recommend to read Vahan Tekeyan's letter to Leon Zavren-Surmelian, whose book I Ask You, Ladies and Gentlemen, we published last year. So it will shed a lot of light, pronounce or not. There is a lot of feeling there. And on that note, I'd like to spotlight Richard Danushian, whose brainchild was publication this book, because he has a question for you.
First, thank you so much for this. This is such a breath of fresh air. It really is. Never in my wildest dreams that I thought I would be participating in something like this. Can you share with us, in your journey, in articulating in your mind this library and putting it all together, did you reach out or come across any other ethnic minority groups who shared the same sort of challenges that the Armenians do? You know, a socially conservative fabric, a strong religious hierarchy, institutional presence. Were there parallels? Did they approach it differently, or what have they done? Did you learn something from them? I'd be very curious to see what your experience in reaching out to groups like that was. Over to you.
That's a great question. Something I've noticed with the organizers, right, the writers who are organizers, as they've begun to branch out to doing more cross-cultural organizing with Southwest Asian countries and Middle Eastern countries, which I think is a really interesting turn. And I'm going to be really fascinated to see like what happens between those dialogues, right, and that writing. For a completely other project that is way too grandiose for me, and but I do a lot. I've been doing a lot of putting together a pretty robust reading list for it, specifically because I'm looking at queer narratives and immigration to the United States, and then it just kind of became queer narratives. The biggest overlap that I see is with folks who are writing from queer perspectives in the Middle East. The novels that I'm reading there, they align more with what I see in the library, more so than the queer narratives that I see from like South America or from Southeast Asia or from Africa. Those are kind of like different trajectories. There's not the same level of like I'm reading a novel right now, America is Not the Heart by, sorry, my library is right there, Elaine Castillo, and has queer characters in there. They're Filipino, obviously a lot of historical trauma around there, a lot of different faith traditions within that cultural community that can be very rigid and monolithic as well. But there's just the fabric of it, the aesthetic of it is very, I don't read it and go, I empathize with it, but I don't read it and go, ooh, yes, right? But there's a novel, oh shoot, where did it go? Oh, the title is Guaro, and it's about an unnamed Arabic country. And I read that one, and I'm like, oh yes, like you could just change, in some instances I'm like, you could just change the names and switch the religion to Armenian Apostolic, and I'm like, this could be an Armenian narrative. So I think that's where I've been seeing a lot of the same overlap, and also there isn't as much literature that's queer identified. Thank you, Rad, for putting that in there. And I think Salim Haddad lives in the UK now, or at least in his bio in the novel, he at the time he was living in the UK. But I lost my train of thought. I don't remember what I was just saying. Yeah, it's gone. Maybe it'll come back to me.
Sort of, while you sort of try to get back your train of thought, if you are, I'm not quite sure how this is going to sort of translate into a question, but one of the things that really, really struck me was that you were somehow trying to sort of recreate a community through this sort of literature that you sort of assembled around you. I remember when I was a child growing up in Cyprus, I was told that if you don't really like your community, create one for yourself. And then I remember sort of coming to university to the UK, and I grew up with Tales of the City, Armistead Maupin's Tales of the City. And in Maybe the Moon, the character was Armenian, but that was the only thing that was actually ever said about his Armenianness. He was just this normal American sort of LA guy. And then sort of, apart from that particular mention that he was Armenian, sort of, there was absolutely nothing. And the Ararat restaurant in San Francisco in Tales of the City, sort of, you basically looked out for all these Armenian little things, etc. So, so we sort of, my generation as well, sort of growing up in the 80s and sort of, coming out in the 80s and all the rest, we sort of surrounded ourselves with what was available, which is obviously nowhere near what's been happening over the past 10, 20 years even. So, so I'm not quite sure how to translate this into a question, but am I actually right that sort of this library itself is a community for you? And is that how you see it?
Well, first fun fact about that character and Maybe the Moon, that character is actually based off of George Stambolian.
Yeah.
So, which my mind like when I was like, what? When I tell friends that I've known for a while that this is what I did this, they were like, that doesn't surprise us at all, because I was the Hermione Granger of my friend set. Like to the library was the first thing that, if I had an issue, like our question, go books always have the answer. So the books were the community. Now there's a couple of folks here in Minnesota that also are Armenian of descent, identify that way and identify as queer as well, that I can talk to, right, and have conversations with. And yes, there is the internet, so there's ways of connecting on Twitter and Instagram. that create an opportunity to like actually have conversations. But for me, absolutely, the books are treasures. Like I value my books more than I value other things. Sorry, one of my partners is listening to this. So I absolutely, they were my community, and in some instances, family of choice, because it was necessary to just, I used books as a way of creating spaces of liberation for myself, right? As a kid in my 20s, of being able to be in that world, even if it was literally just right here, to say another life is possible. Someone wrote this book, so it must be possible. Someone else is imagining it. So with all the titles in the library, to be able, again, to sit in that space, I can't necessarily talk to that artist or that writer, but I do have what they wrote. I do have their characters, or in some instances their memoir. And so I'm able to sit there and be in conversation with them, and to be feeling with them, right? And that to me is the power of literature, is that I can open up this page of papers and, you know, ink, and I'm feeling all of these things, right? Because of it. And the feelings are important for my healing, because it allowed me to feel, right? Being able to name something for the first time, being able to be allowed in that space to feel something, kind of shook something loose, right? Either in terms of grief, or in being able to just look at something and being like, oh, that sucked, but it happened in the past. It's not happening now. And I can reflect, I can have that distance from it, because I was able to read through these books and able to combine that with my own healing process, which is important to have that space. Did I answer your question? I felt like I went on for a while there.
Okay. No, I think you did, and sort of, you know, and of course mentioning George Stambolian, it's really interesting. I never actually made that connection for Maybe the Moon with George Stambolian, and I'm really grateful that you actually mentioned him, because he's completely forgotten. I mean, he was such an important figure, and of course that brings in this whole discussion about AIDS as well, and he died of AIDS, and it is another taboo that Armenian communities generally try to sort of push under the carpet and all the rest. So in my father's car, the short story in which he actually deals with this sort of Armenian identity is a wonderful, wonderful story. It's sort of, you know, it was really, really important in those days to actually be able, in the 80s, to be able to actually read about Armenian gay people. So thank you. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we have
I don't know where I found it. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go on. Finish your thought.
No, I think it's in an interview that Armistead revealed that it was George, that he was modeling that character after. So it's not readily known. You would have to dig around to find that mock-up. But sorry, Tato, sorry. I'm talking and it's 9 o'clock.
That's fine. We have still one or two quick questions. I think Elise Yousefyan had a very interesting comment about the language, about queer identity, and I'll just spotlight Elise for a second to add her comment. Elise, another wonderful poet, by the way. Everyone go and read her beautiful works.
Oh, thank you so much, Tato, and everyone here, and JP. I mean, I could not be more moved by this whole gathering. So I'll keep my comment short because I know we're winding things down. But the discussion on language and the translation, the idea of translating like words in English and concepts in English into Armenian, there's also kind of the reverse flow in terms of what I think of as like indigenous consciousness and cosmology, ancient cultures, and how that can inform English, because I always struggle with English and the whole Armenian American identity. But so I once was studying with a Native American psychologist who's half Apache, named Eduardo Duran. Maybe you're familiar with his work. He has a book called Healing the Soul Wound. Incredible. But anyway, so he brought up this idea of, in terms of consciousness, that for a lot of communities he works with, the languages are much more verbally oriented. Things are not fixed in place. English is very fixed. Things get put in boxes. People get put in boxes. And so one example he gave was, if you see someone, instead of saying, and this brings up, of course, issues of gender identity as well, but instead of saying, oh, there's a woman there, it might be, oh, I see someone who is womaning. And so for me, that just brings up so many possibilities and a sense of openness. And I was wondering if you had any more thoughts to share about how language is reshaping things, not just in Armenian, but in English too, because English can be limited, and how there might be this kind of continual flow to uplift what is needed.
Oof. That's a big question. It's a huge question. A couple of yes, I think that or at least in my experience of it, having the words allows for, right, different types of cognition, and I think first what I'm thinking is that so like being bilingual with French and English, I get suffocated when I'm in French because of all of it's so rigid in terms of gender. So rigid in terms of gender. Everything has a gender. Like, why does a computer mouse need to have a gender? But it does. And so I can't wait sometimes to get back into English, where I'm like, okay, at least we have a little bit more ability to move around. But to your point, it's not as, it is pretty, it can be very rigid, right, as well. As I've been learning very beginners Armenian, it feels really kind of like, woo, wow, what's happening here? Like word order can be where you don't necessarily need the pronoun because of the conjugation. So I think that there is something to be learned from indigenous languages to come into Western discourse, particularly because Western discourse is very colonial, right? It's all about colonizing, right? And then erasing linguistic differences. So I think there could be a lot that indigenous knowledge that's derived from being a different language. That also, like, for, you know, in the US, we have these racial identity categories, right, that are depicted. Whereas like in Southwest Asia, it feels like it's not a racial category, it's more of a linguistic faith tradition, ethnicity that brings together a people, right? Whereas over here, it's like you're white, or you're Black African American, or you're Latinx, or you're Asian, right? And the end. And so there's nuances, I think, of identity that absolutely can be brought in, that can destabilize and help advance anti-racism work in the West. My final thought that I get a little bit nervous about when Western words of queer identity get imported into Armenian is that it reinforces this idea that the West is destabilizing Armenia. I think, Nick, to your earlier point, that this is all a conspiracy to destabilize, you know, George. I mean, literally, I've seen some stuff on the internet like George Soros, and I don't know why he gets pulled into everything, but like George Soros and the liberals in the West are trying to destroy Armenia by importing all of this, you know, queerness into the country. And I get a little bit nervous when Western words are kind of brought into that context, because I'm like, how is this going to underscore, right, that particular narrative? And so that's why I really think it's fascinating what Queer in Yerevan is doing around Darorinag, Tarorinak, right, of how finding the words, what is a word that is more Armenian, right, but also can queer the language itself, as opposed to just let's just bring in gay, or let's just bring in pansexual right into, or asexual into the language. Obviously, I could go on for a while, so I'm just gonna stop right there.
Great,
I think
thank
we've
you.
gone way time.
Thanks, JP. Just one last question from our own Susan Pattis.
Hi, JP. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. And we have our own libraries. We totally understand community and library. It's such a wonderful thing to share. But the work that you put into it is incredible. I noticed that you mentioned writing yourself a few times, and I wondered if you are working on something. If so, could we hear about it? If not, or both, two questions if you have time. What gaps do you see that you would like to see filled? What would you encourage somebody to write? What would you like to see in your library that's not there already?
I'm gonna dodge the first question and answer that question. No, I think aspiring is a very generous, overly generous term to where I am at in my writing. So maybe stay tuned. I've been doing a lot of personal essay explorations, and then that got really depressing, and so I'm still doing those projects, but I'm trying to also venture into fiction so I can be a little bit more upbeat and happy and explore. So that's why I'm really, there's a project I'm working on, a short story about that's kind of inspired by Vahan Tekeyan's poetry. But so stay tuned. I don't, we'll see what comes of that. What would I like to see more gaps? The first gap is that, okay, we have the library, but too many of these texts I had to track down. And so there's something, for me, a project that I would love to see happen is reprinting of work. Because it's like some of these films, you can't actually, like Apricot Groves, it's an amazing film, but unless the director takes it back on screening, you can't get to it right now, currently. Some of the books, like, there's one that was literally, it's trapped, there's no copy to buy, it's trapped in university libraries. I was actively considering stealing it from a university library until, thank you, Nancy, found a copy, and she's gonna graciously, she had an extra copy that she's gonna send to me. So the first thing I think is, how do we make sure that these books are available to folks so that they can either rent them or borrow them or can buy them for their own collections? I would love to see more young adult fiction. I think the more young adult fiction that we have, the more that will help win the long game, for lack of a better phrase. I would generally like to see more novels as well. I would get very, and that's from my personal, I read so much Armenian literature prior to this, and I would get so frustrated that even our novelists, I was like, really? You're a novelist. You can't imagine a queer character? Like, seriously? So I would love to see more fiction come through, particularly the novel. I think that would be fascinating, and realizing that's a lot of work, but that's an area that I would love to see more of. I'd like to also see more memoirs, in the sense of, I don't think that there should just be the two trans memoirs and the one bisexual memoir and the one lesbian memoir and the one gay memoir, right? There needs to be, there's more to these identities that needs to be found out and explored. And so finding a way, and hopefully this will be a way through Yala and their queer lit department, that we can begin to nurture those writers, or provide a space for current writers to advance their projects that are giving more of that nuance around these identities and what it can be like to, because the firsts or the seconds shouldn't be the lasts. So in that particular, I think fiction, young adult fiction, and then memoirs, I think I'd like to see more of, me personally. But I think those could be immediate gap areas, right, if you will, for any funders who want to give grants to writers.
Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah, thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, JP. And that's a really perfect note to end on, a call for all the writers out there and all the funding bodies and all the associations to keep producing this. And I agree, there can't ever be a last. This needs to be something that pluralizes and represents all of the brilliant diversity of the intersecting identities that you've uncovered for us. So thank you so much. We feel really honored to be able to have made this space for you. And it's something as well that we, as I said at the beginning, this is part of a broader project. We want to make more spaces like this, have more discussions like this. So if any friends who are joining this evening or who are watching this on YouTube afterwards know of projects, please get in touch with the Armenian Institute. But JP, thank you so much. I hope you get to have a look through the chat and see just how inspired people are, and just what a beautiful experience you've given to all of them.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate this time.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining, and come back next week. We have a few wonderful films to screen.